In a quiet Nigerian village, there lived a man named Nnamdi. Nnamdi was not a rich man, but he worked hard to provide for his family. His wife, Enkay, was a kind woman who sold vegetables in the market, and together they had 3 children. Chibuzo, their eldest son Enkay, their second son, and Ada, their daughter. Though their lives were modest, their home was filled with love, laughter, and togetherness. But despite the happiness within his home, Nnamdi harbored a deep envy for the wealthier men in the village. He watched with bitter eyes as they walked around in fine clothes, lived in large houses, and were treated with respect wherever they went. Among these wealthy men was Chike, a childhood friend of Nnamdi who had once been just like him, poor, struggling to make ends meet. One evening, there was a grand feast at the home of Chief Okeke, the richest man in the village. Nnamdi, although hesitant to attend, was invited by Chike. The thought of mingling with the rich, eating fine food, and drinking expensive wine tempted Nnamdi, even though he knew he didn't belong there. "Come, Nnamdi, you must join us," Chike had said. "We're old friends. There's no reason for you to miss out." Reluctantly, Nnamdi put on his best, though worn-out clothes, and went to the gathering. As he entered Chief Okeke's courtyard, he felt immediately out of place. The other men were dressed in fine fabrics, their wrists and necks adorned with gold. They ate and laughed loudly, their plates piled high with meat and jollof rice. Nnamdi, in his threadbare outfit, shrank in comparison. For a moment, Nnamdi tried to blend in, sitting at the far edge of the gathering. He filled a small plate with food and sipped his drink quietly, hoping to go unnoticed. But soon, Chike and a few other men noticed him. Chike, with a sly grin, called out to him across the room, "Nnamdi, you've enjoyed the food, haven't you?" Nnamdi nodded hesitantly, unsure of where this conversation was headed. Another man, named Dobina, laughed and added, "Yes, Nnamdi, since you've eaten well, why don't you help us by collecting the plates?" The group erupted in laughter. Nnamdi froze, his heart sinking. He looked at them in disbelief, wondering if they were serious. "We're all friends," Nnamdi said, trying to maintain his dignity. "Just because I'm not as wealthy doesn't mean you can treat me this way." Chike leaned forward, his smile turning sinister. "If you don't collect the plates, Nnamdi, we'll tell Chief Okeke that you haven't contributed anything to the feast. Imagine how embarrassing that would be for you." Nnamdi's face burned with shame. His pride urged him to stand up for himself, but the humiliation of being called out in front of the wealthiest men in the village overwhelmed him. He had no choice. Quietly, he stood up and began to collect the plates, feeling smaller with every step. His so-called friends continued to laugh as he worked, treating him like a servant instead of their equal. After the feast, Nnamdi left the gathering with his head hung low. The humiliation weighed heavily on him. How had it come to this? Once they had all been equals, working the same fields, sharing the same struggles. But now, because of their wealth, they looked down on him, mocking him like he was less than a man. When Nnamdi returned home that night, Enkay noticed the sadness in his eyes. "Nnamdi, what happened?" she asked gently. He sighed, sinking into a chair. "My friends, they treated me like a servant because I don't have as much money as they do." Enkay knelt beside him, taking his hand. "We may not have wealth, but we have each other. We have our family, and that's what matters." But Nnamdi was not comforted. That night, as Enkay and the children slept, he stayed awake, his mind racing with thoughts of the wealth he didn't have and the respect he craved. He knew he wanted more money, more power, more respect, and he knew he could never have it working the fields for other men. Days passed, but the bitterness remained. He began to avoid his friends, ashamed of the way they had treated him, yet still envious of the lives they lived. Then one afternoon, as he worked the fields, Chike approached him. "Nnamdi, I can tell you've been upset since the feast," Chike said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "But I can help you. I can show you how to rise from this life of poverty. There's a way to get everything you want." Nnamdi's heart pounded with curiosity and desire. "What do you mean?" "There's a group of us," Chike said, lowering his voice. "A powerful organization. Some call it a cult. We control more wealth than you can imagine. But to join us, you must be willing to make a sacrifice. A real sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Nnamdi asked, a hint of fear creeping into his voice. Chike smiled darkly. "Come with me tonight, and you'll see." Later that night, Nnamdi followed Chike deep into the forest, where they met with the other members of the cult. The leader, an old man with piercing eyes, stood before Nnamdi and spoke. "You seek wealth, Nnamdi?" the old man asked. "I do," Nnamdi replied, though his voice trembled. The old man nodded. "Then you must give something of great value in return. The cult demands a sacrifice. Your firstborn son, Chibuzo." Nnamdi's breath caught in his throat. "My son? No, I can't." "You must," the old man said coldly. "Wealth comes with a price. If you refuse, you will lose everything. But if you accept, riches beyond your dreams will be yours." Nnamdi wrestled with the decision for days. He loved his son dearly, but the thought of remaining poor, of being humiliated by his friends again, pushed him toward a dark decision. Finally, one evening, he made up his mind. Nnamdi took Chibuzo to the fields under the pretense of checking the traps they had set. As they walked together, Nnamdi's heart ached with guilt. Chibuzo, unaware of his father's dark intentions, smiled and talked about his future, his dreams of growing up to be a strong and respected man like his father. But Nnamdi's soul was consumed by greed. When they reached the far end of the field, Nnamdi took out the dark handkerchief that the cult had given him. Tears streamed down his face as he used it to take his son's life. Chibuzo's struggle was brief, and as Nnamdi buried him under the cover of night, the weight of his actions crushed him. Nnamdi returned home that night, telling Nkechi that Chibuzo had gone to visit relatives in a neighboring village. The guilt gnawed at him, but within days, his life began to change. His crops flourished like never before, and he quickly rose to become one of the wealthiest men in the village. He built a large house, hired workers, and his family enjoyed luxuries they had never known. But the cult was not done with him. A few months later, Chike returned with another demand. "The cult requires another sacrifice, Nnamdi. Your second son, Enkay, must be next." This time, Nnamdi didn't hesitate. The first sacrifice had broken his heart, but his greed had hardened it. He took Enkay to the fields one evening, just as he had done with Chibuzo, and once again, he used the dark handkerchief to take his son's life. He buried Enkay beside his brother, and the lie he told Nkechi was the same. Enkay had gone to visit family. But Nkechi had grown suspicious. Her sons had been gone too long, and she noticed how distant and cold Nnamdi had become. She began to pray fervently, asking God for guidance and protection over her family, especially her daughter Ada. One night, as Nkechi prayed, she had a dream. In the dream, a voice warned her that Ada was in danger. Nkechi woke in a panic, knowing she had to protect her daughter. Meanwhile, the cult had made its final demand. Nnamdi was ordered to sacrifice his only daughter, Ada. The thought of killing his daughter tormented him, but his greed had consumed him entirely. One night, while everyone slept, Nnamdi crept into Ada's room, the evil handkerchief clutched in his hand. As he stood over his daughter, ready to take her life, his vision blurred and suddenly everything went dark. He had been struck blind. In his panic, Nnamdi cried out, waking Nkechi. She rushed to Ada's room, finding her daughter unharmed, and pulled her into her arms. Nnamdi, now blind and helpless, began to confess everything: the cult, the sacrifices, the lies. "I've killed our sons," he sobbed. "I was blinded by greed, and now I've lost everything." Nkechi, heartbroken but resolute, packed her things and left with Ada. They moved far away, and Nnamdi was left alone in his crumbling house, shunned by the villagers. His wealth vanished overnight, his lands withered, and his so-called friends in the cult abandoned him. Once a man envied for his riches, Nnamdi was now despised and feared. No one spoke to him or even looked him in the eye. He wandered the village, blind and broken, haunted by the memory of his children and the price of his greed.